女士们、先生们，我今天很兴荣有机会参加你们的排华法案100周年研讨会，和你们的公平多元公荣证明奖典礼。我希望介绍那个排华法案的起源和后果。希望它能帮助推安今天的反种族主义的战斗。I am indeed honored to be with you today, and I wanted to begin by joining in and acknowledging this as the traditional territory of many indigenous nations. And I honor their elders, leaders, and knowledge keepers as the guardians of this land, past, present, and future. July 1st of this year marks the 100th anniversary of the coming into effect of the Chinese Immigration Act of 1923, also known as the Chinese Exclusion Act. Until it was repealed in 1947, this legislation effectively barred people of Chinese origins and descent, as the Act said, from coming into Canada. And today I'd like to talk about the Act, some of its effects, what motivated it, and how this relates to a larger history of racism and colonialism in Canada. And I'm doing so in hope of drawing some important parallels between 1923 and the anti-Chinese racism and xenophobia that we are facing today. A word of warning, I will be sharing with you some examples of the racist language, the racist talk of the past. And this can be very difficult to hear, especially for those of us for whom this is not just something in a distant past, but is an ongoing reality. But I feel it's important to see these words to really understand the nature and extent of racism. The Chinese Exclusion Act barred people of Chinese origins from immigrating to Canada and effectively ended Chinese immigration until it was repealed in 1947. Although estimates vary as to the number of Chinese admitted to Canada during this time, our best information is that between 1923 and 1947, a total of 44 Chinese people were admitted into the country. To put this in perspective, during the same era, 1.25 million European immigrants were admitted into the country. Among those admitted were the members of this family. This is the Poi family. William Poi, the father, was an Australian-born British subject who had been a successful businessman in Hong Kong, where he also worked with the Canadian Trade Commission. In 1942, the family of refugees was repatriated to Canada on a Red Cross ship. And the only reason that the Poi family was admitted was that in the conditions of the war, it was impossible to force their return to Australia. The 2-year-old girl in this picture is named Adrian, better known as her professional name as Adrian Clarkson, and grew up to become the 26th Governor General of Canada. Immigration restrictions were not new on people of Chinese origins in 1923. In 1885, the federal government imposed a $50 head tax on Chinese workers and their families. The head tax never applied to Chinese merchants and their families. But the head tax was then raised to $100 in 1901 and $500 in 1903, which would have been as much as a year's income for a working class family during that era. The earlier head tax had made immigration difficult, but not entirely impossible. For example, in 1913, which is the year that saw the largest single year for the number of immigrants entering Canada before the modern era, 400,000 immigrants were admitted to the country. Of these, 6,300 were Chinese. The Chinese had to pay the head tax, but the Europeans, who were mainly farmers from Eastern and Southern Europe, were being given free land to come to the country. Even though the Exclusion Act supposedly allowed for certain exceptions, in practice it was universally applied, and anybody who was admitted was always admitted under special circumstances. It's important to note that there are multiple effects of the Exclusion Act. One of the first effects is that it trapped the wives and families and children of people who were already in Canada, particularly Chinese workers, in China during the warlord era and during the violence of the Japanese invasion. These men remained in Canada, suffering years of loneliness, in constant hope of news from home, and living as cheaply as possible in order to be able to send money back to China to support their families. Ironically, this fed into some of the racist discourse because it was then widely believed that the Chinese could live on a lower standard of living than other people, but it was actually the immigration realities that was forcing people to do this. At the same time, the trans-Pacific family links that this involved has always been a key feature of Chinese-Canadian experience and continues to this day. To appreciate the scale of this exclusion, according to the 1941 census, there were 29,033 Chinese males in Canada, of whom 25,556, or 81%, were married. By contrast, there were only 2,337 females, of whom 1,177, or 50%, were married. Since racism made marriage with non-Chinese women almost impossible during this era, this meant that at least 22,000 men had families trapped in China. The exclusion accentuated the gender imbalance in Chinese Canadian communities that had already been produced by the head tax. So in 1941, there was one Chinese female for every 12 men. Vancouver, in the largest community, which is the largest community in Victoria, which was the oldest, had a gender ratios of 5 males per female. Toronto's was 8-to-1, and the city of Kingston, like many other centres in Canada, had actually no women at all. This gender imbalance only disappears in 1986. One of the effects of this gender imbalance, too, was that the second generation, the Canadian-born, was tiny, and also about 8% of the overall population. In many ways, the case of Yun Ho Chong of Vancouver is typical. He arrived in 1908, paying the head tax. He returns to China in 1911, where he marries her, and he spends 3 months with his wife. And as recalled, I went back several times, but I couldn't bring her over without paying the $500 head tax that all Chinese had to pay. And then after 1923, she wasn't allowed to come at all. And his wife was only able to come to Canada in 1949. The Exclusion Act also required people of Chinese origin or descent to register with the federal government and obtain a certificate with a photo ID. The failure to register or to produce a certificate on request made the person liable to fines, imprisonment, and deportation. As the Vancouver-based Chinese language newspaper Dahan Gungbao, or the Chinese Times, records, people were indeed prosecuted for failing to register and deported back to China. The Chinese are the only people in the history of Canada who've had to register with the government to prove that they had the right to live here. One of the effects of the Exclusion Act was it froze the development of Chinese communities across Canada and produced a stark decline. While 56,000 people registered under the Act in 1924, by 1941, there were only about 32,000 Chinese in Canada. The Act's requirements to register also appears to have cause a significant number of people to have to live underground. Not everyone could prove that they had paid the head tax or had immigrated legally. And those who had lost their certificates could supposedly get replacements, but you had to have people who were credible to testify to you. For example, Alice Fong Jutoi was able to obtain a replacement head tax certificate shown here. She had arrived in Canada in 1893 as a 7-year-old orphan with another family, supposedly her cousins, who paid the head tax for her. Because she was active in Montreal's Chinese Presbyterian Church, various respectable people could support her in her story. Others would not have been so lucky and remained unable to prove they could legally live here. The regulations also caused to promote a phenomenon known as paper sons. The act provided that Chinese people could leave Canada, provided they returned within a certain period of time. So as a result, when people died, fell ill, or suffered other mishaps if they were visiting people in China, other people, usually close relatives, would use their papers to come to Canada. Paper sons then often spent their entire lives in Canada in terror at the idea that they would be deported at any moment if they were exposed. And just to give one example, my family knows of the case of a man who was a paper son, and he was a prominent professional in his field. He actually was one of the most important people in the country in establishing his industry as one of the leading industries of Canada. And in the 1980s, when there was an amnesty for paper sons, he was afraid to get regularized status and did not apply because he was afraid he was going to be deported, even though he had been in the country for over 60 years. The ad also adversely affected the Canadian-born. They too had to register under the act, no matter their age or how long they had lived in the country. And one such person is this person, Juan Alexander Camille. Juan Jinyo is his Chinese name. He's the first Chinese Canadian. He's born in Fort Harrison, BC in 1861. He went to school with Richard McBride, the first BC-born premier. His parents were merchants who ran a store, and he grew up speaking Hakka, which was their language, as well as several dialects of Cantonese, English, and also the Chinook indigenous trade language. He was an upstanding member of the Anglican Church. He had trained as a lawyer, but was unable to practice because he was not on the voters list, because he was not allowed to be because he was Chinese. And at the time he registered, he was the official Chinese and Chinook language interpreter for the Vancouver Police Department. But he had to register at the age of 63, again to prove that he could stay in the country. The requirement to register also, I think, had a psychological effect on Canadian-born Chinese, to the point where I think even years later, because they had to register, they always had in the back of their minds the idea that somehow they were foreigners who didn't really belong and were always outsiders to Canada. And I argue that I can see it in this case. This is the certificates of the Fong sisters, who were all born in Montreal, and they had to register. The youngest, 8-year-old Annie Fong, spent her entire life in Montreal, lived to the ripe old age of 100, but she kept her certificate with her for her entire life. I know this because she was my mother. And Ju Toy, Mrs. Alice Fong, who you saw earlier, was my grandmother. Even after its repeal, the effects of the Exclusion Act lived on. Chinese immigration continued to be restricted to a few hundred people a year until 1967, when the racially based quota system was abolished in favor of the point system. But the Act also solidified the idea that the Chinese are foreigners who don't belong in Canada, no matter how long they lived here, or even if they were born here. And this idea is central to the dominant ways in which people and things Chinese are imagined and represented in Canada up to and including the present. While Canada's connections to people and things European are taken for granted, their connections to things Chinese, to other Asians, and indeed to Africans, and for that matter to Indigenous peoples, are excluded from nationalist representation and imaginings. And we can see these exclusions at work in the debates that lead up to the Chinese Exclusion Act. In 1922, this man, William Garland Macquarie, the MP for New Westminster, introduced a resolution, which you see here, to the House of Commons, calling on the government to exclude all Orientals, a term that included the Chinese as well as the Japanese. According to Macquarie, the so-called rapid multiplication of Chinese and Japanese was, quote, becoming a serious menace to living conditions, particularly on the Pacific coast, and to the future of the country in general. And consequently, he called on the government to exclude immigration of this type. To support his resolution, he read into the record of the House of Commons a series of resolutions. The first was from the British Columbia Provincial Legislature. It called on the federal parliament, quote, to totally restrict the immigration of Asiatics, unquote, into BC, quote, in view of the wishes of the people of British Columbia that this province be reserved for the people of European race, unquote. Resolutions from the Retail Merchants Association of Canada, the Chamber of Commerce in Victoria, the Great War Veterans Association, the United Farmers of British Columbia, the Trades and Labour Council of Canada, all called for exclusion on Asians, and most of these resolutions also called for blocking Asians from owning or renting land. The Asiatic Exclusion League of Canada cabled Macquarie that, quote, 40,000 British Columbians, members of the League, stand solidly behind you in your fight for a white Canada. These resolutions and the speeches of Macquarie and other members of Parliament recycled a series of allegations about East Asians that by the 1920s have become taken for granted as absolute truths by most English-speaking Canadians. They claim that the Chinese and Japanese were not only culturally different from so-called Canadians, but were biologically different as well, genetically able to endure lower standards of living and able to work harder and thus outcompete white workers. They claim that these differences were fixed and immutable and could never be changed, not even changed through intermarriage between different groups. Indeed, Macquarie justified his resolution on the basis that the races were so fundamentally different that, quote, intermarriage does not tend to perpetuate the qualities of either race, and their morals are different, and language, hereditary, religion, and ideals will mitigate against and ever prevent any sociological assimilation of immigrants. Today, we tend to think of racial differences as sort of natural and obvious. It's part of our common sense, for example, to sort people into categories of white, black, East Asian, and so forth. But in fact, what constitutes racial differences and the alleged qualities that are associated with them are specific to time and place. So just to give you some examples. In Britain, until the 1980s, the term black referred to all people of color, referred to people from Africa, from people from India, people from China. To call people from China black in North America makes simply no sense. But in fact, in Britain, this was a term that so-called black people themselves used to build anti-racist alliances and movements. In 19th century US, Irish Catholics were considered to be black and became white as the century went on. The apartheid regime in South Africa defined Chinese and Japanese people along with mixed race people as so-called coloreds. But as they developed trade relations with Japan, they relabeled the Japanese white, not the Chinese. The ancient Greeks were well aware of racial differences, skin color differences. But like the ancient Chinese, they saw people as either civilized or barbarians. And civilized people included the black-skinned people of Ethiopia, and barbarians included the white-skinned, blue-eyed people on the steppes of Europe. In much of the 19th century in England, the term race referred to social types. So people would talk about the race of London cabbies, for example. And in 1883, an American historian, Herbert Howe Bancroft, noted that schemes for classifying the human species into races range from one, so the idea there's a single species called the human race, to as many as 66 different ones. And that consequently, quote, we cannot but conclude that there are no absolute lines of separation between the members of various of the human family. Race is not a biological reality. And this is just a website of the American Anthropological Association, which is really a superb resource on debunking common understandings of race. If we lined up all the people in the world, from those who have the darkest skins to those who have the lightest skin, there is no point at which one group becomes another group. Change, the variation is gradual and continuous. No matter how we define a population, the genetic differences within the population are greater than the average differences between them. Now, it's important to note that although I'm saying that race is not a biological reality, I am not saying that race isn't real, because it is real socially. Racism works by taking people and plugging them into racial categories. And how you're plugged into those categories can even shape whether you stay alive or not, depending on the context. And the thing that makes racism so violent is that however you're plugged into those categories, it's something that's done to you. It's not something to say, excuse me, actually that's not me. Right? That doesn't matter. Because racisms are always based on exclusions. That racism is manufactured, and that the idea of race is organized into exclusions, means that we can actually find moments in history of people actually doing this. And we can see it in the case of this man. In 1885, John A. Macdonald was debating the legislation that he called his greatest triumph, more important than the railroad, more important than Confederation. The Electoral Franchise Act that he was debating was supposed to create a system, a federal electoral system that he would personally control and ensure Tory rule forever. During the debate over the Franchise Act, he proposed that, quote, Chinamen should not have the right to vote on the grounds that they were, quote, foreigners, and the Chinese has no British instincts or British feelings or aspirations. When a member of the opposition asked whether Chinamen who naturalized ceased to be Chinamen, i.e. became Canadian, Macdonald amended his cultural definition of Chineseness based on origin to a biological one. He excluded, quote, a person of Mongolian or Chinese race. Right? That this was a new idea is shown by the reaction of the other members of the House of Commons. Members of the opposition objected that the Chinese were industrious people who had voted in the last election and had, quote, as good a right to be allowed to vote as any other British subjects of foreign extraction, unquote. This led Macdonald to make clear that Chinese exclusion was a matter, really, of European dominance. He warned, if the Chinese came in great numbers and settled on the Pacific coast, they might control the vote in that whole province. And they would send Chinese representatives to sit here and who would represent Chinese eccentricities, Chinese immorality, Asiatic principles, altogether opposite to our wishes. And in the even balance of parties, they might enforce those Asiatic principles, those immoralities, the eccentricities which are abhorrent to the Aryan race and Aryan principles on this house. So we've seen that complaints about Chinese foreign ways interfering and threatening Canadian ones is in fact new, as certain unnamed foreign interference scandals might suggest. Did I say that out loud? Yeah. Macdonald then claimed that Chinese and Europeans were separate species. He said, the Aryan race will not wholesomely amalgamate with the Africans or Asiatics, and the cross of those races is like the cross of the fox and the dog, and is not successful, it cannot be, and never will be. Chinese exclusion was necessary, he told the House, or, quote, the Aryan character of the future of British America should be destroyed, unquote. His comments, if you read the House of Commons debates and Senate debates, actually shocked the other members. He was the only member of Parliament to use the term Aryan during the 1870s, 1880s, as well as the only member to argue that Asians were a separate species from Europeans. A few years previously, the previous Prime Minister, Alexander Mackenzie, had even rejected calls for Chinese restrictions as, quote, unseemly for a British community. And he further told the House of Commons that to avow the principle that some classes of the human family were not fit to be residents of this dominion would be dangerous and contrary to the law of nations and the policy which controlled Canada. When Macdonald's Franchise Act reached the Senate, and it took him 2 years, by the way, to get this act through the House of Commons, so this was a big achievement, the senators debated whether they could get away with voting it down. And the Senate, a year later, tried to actually repeal the Chinese Immigration Act, and then 2 years later, and the year after that, actually voted down further restrictions on the Chinese. So if the idea of fundamental racial difference was new in 1885, by 1923, the idea that the world was made up of different biologically defined races, each with different social and moral characteristics, and that race missing was dangerous, had become commonplace. It's an idea that had been repeated by prime ministers, newspapers, popular novels, academic publications, and the speeches of civic leaders. It was even taught to young people as an objective truth, a scientific principle, as true as the idea that the Earth goes around the sun. So this is an example of a 1904 high school geography text used in Canada until actually the beginning of the Second World War. It includes this illustration. On the left, you see the iconic sort of male figures, and on the right, it lists the characteristics of the races of mankind. And under the characteristics, the mental characteristics, it lists Ethiopians as unintellectual, no science or letters. Mongolians as sullen, sluggish, active in the temperate zone, sluggish in the southern zones. Their culture not of the modern kind. Americans, that's to say indigenous people, are stern, moody, not emotional, slight knowledge of the arts. Caucasians, by contrast, are active and enterprising, science, arts, and letters, highly developed. As a former professor of education, I can just imagine how teachers would have had students memorize these characteristics and spit them back out on an exam. It's just like, it's a teacher thing. Apologies to the teachers in the audience. Other textbooks that taught that Chinese and Japanese were at best temporary residents in Canada. So for example, this widely used grade 1 social studies textbook published in 1924 shows Chinese and Japanese children are described as, quote, visitors in Canada, whose real homes are in China and Japan, which is contrasted to their representation, the book's representations of white people and people from Europe who are new Canadians, who we are happy to have in this country. The idea of immutable cultural and racial difference linked to moral differences runs throughout the debate over Macquarie's resolution, and indeed the debate in 1923 over the Act, which tended to be shorter because the main debate was in 22. While some MPs felt the resolution went too far because it didn't allow for any exceptions, others felt it didn't go far enough because it didn't expel those Orientals already in Canada from the country. The only person who questioned its basis was J.S. Woodworth, who's the founder of the CCF party, the precursor to today's NDP. He did not, however, object to exclusion per se, but he argued that Chinese men already in Canada should be allowed to bring their wives to Canada in order to prevent what he called, quote, immorality, unquote. This concern, however, did not stop him from voting in favor of the 1923 exclusion law. One of the interesting things to think about here is how much this actually idea that Chinese can't assimilate, that Macquarie is pushing, Macquarie knows to be a lie. He's from New Westminster. One of the most prominent people from New Westminster was Juan Alexander Camille, who was living in Vancouver at the time, but Macquarie would have known Camille personally, probably met him at the Anglican Church. Like all racist claims, the claim that Chinese were so different that they couldn't assimilate to Canadian values and institutions was not true. And we can see this in the case of the Canadian-born young adults of Vancouver and Victoria. So this is a photo of the Chinese Canadian Club soccer team from Victoria in 1923. Everyone in this picture is Canadian-born. Most were the children of Chinese merchants or professional families. All had been educated in Canadian public schools and were fluent in English. Many were even graduates of high school in a time when few people attended high school, and some were graduates of university. They had also attended Chinese language schools and had various degrees of literacy in Chinese. And indeed, their club president, Joe Hope, who had been born in Victoria in 1892, had even graduated from a high school in China. Formed in 1914 as a young men's social club, they had a well-appointed library that included the complete works of Jane Austen. And in a world that said that to be Chinese meant that you could never be Canadian, or Canadians could never be Chinese, they invented a term that we take for granted today that exactly described the reality of their lives. They called themselves Chinese Canadians. By the 1920s, they had become politically active, unsuccessfully lobbying for the right to vote for Canadian-born and war veterans. And in 1922-3, they organized a year-long student strike of the Victoria public school system when the school board tried to segregate all Chinese students in Chinese-only schools. This is, here I'm plugging my book, which is based on the student strike. The student strike, as they called it, to support it, they mobilized the support of the entire Chinese community in Victoria, as well as in Vancouver and in other centers across the country. They raised enough money to provide free Chinese language schooling for the 240 striking students for the entire year. And they brought together, for the first time in the Chinese community, people of different origins, people who spoke different languages, and of vastly different politics. They also launched a letter-writing campaign in the English language newspapers that disproved the school board's arguments about why segregation was necessary, and won over enough white voters that trustees opposing segregation were elected in the 1923 school board elections. They continued the strike until the school board allowed Chinese students to return to the original integrated classes at the beginning of the 1923 school year. We have further evidence of the way in which Chinese Canadians were assimilated to dominant values through the people of this photo. This is a picture of Juan Alexander Camilleau's family in 1921. Camilleau is sitting fourth from the left. Beside him is his daughter Grace, who is holding his fourth generation Canadian grandson. Next to Grace is her husband, Cecil Sichun Lee, who was born in Victoria and graduated Columbia University, who was working for the Royal Bank of Canada. Importantly, Camilleau was, I mentioned, of Hakka origins, and it's unlikely that Grace spoke Cantonese with any degree of fluency. Cecil, by contrast, would not have spoken any Hakka. Thus, the language of their household was almost certainly English. In 1924, Winifred Rauschenbusch, a researcher for the University of Chicago, visited their house and recorded it as, quote, the first Chinese home belonging to a very smart young couple that I visited. She described their home as, quote, undistinguished and American in its furnishings with a statue of the three Graces on the mantel. She described Cecil Lee as having an unusually good library in which the Encyclopedia Britannica was his Bible. And she described Grace as an accomplished pianist and noted her social instincts were so sure they could just as capably have been the wife of any young businessman. Second and third generation Chinese Canadians, as well as first generation ones, but in the case of second and third generation, despite being totally assimilated to people and things Canadian, lived their lives circumvented by racism and white supremacy at every turn. In British Columbia, by 1923, over 100 pieces of provincial legislation discriminated against the Chinese. They were not allowed to vote or to run for elected office in any elections, federal, provincial, municipal, or school board. They could not work for the provincial government on Crown contracts for provincially incorporated companies or hold Crown timber and mining licenses. They were banned from entire industries. Municipal regulations barred them from using public facilities such as Victoria's Crystal Pool, and often barred them from obtaining certain business licenses. They could not become lawyers or pharmacists because they were not on the voters list. And in practice, they could not become teachers because no school board would hire them. And their children were as often as not forced to attend segregated schools or classes. They were subject to popular violence that ethnically cleansed entire regions of British Columbia of Chinese and other Asians. Chinese language newspapers during this era were constantly reporting on what areas of the province had become hostile to the Chinese and needed to be avoided. Chinatowns in Vancouver, Victoria, Cumberland, and Vernon were classic ghettos, places of relative safety in a hostile geography. And we see this at work in 1907. Following a rally held by the Asiatic Exclusion League, in which a sizable part of the city population attended, the rally, sponsored by all 54 of the city's white-only trade unions and addressed by provincial, federal, and municipal politicians, The crowd rioted through Vancouver's Chinatown and the Japanese Quarter. People outside the area were threatened with violence and assaulted, and one young Chinese man was found hanged the next day on the other side of the city. A suicide, according to the police, but his friends in the Chinese community said he had not had suicidal thoughts. Fearing a pogrom, the leading Chinese merchants went to the local gunsmith and bought up their supply of revolvers, which they distributed to establish their own armed patrols, while Chinese workers responded by launching a strike. As late as the 1920s, the residents of Canton Alley, which is, you can see just through this gate, maintained a metal gate that could be closed at a moment's notice at this opening, in fear that there could be another riot. It should be noted that much of this discriminatory legislation also applied to First Nations people. They too were blocked from voting in BC and nationally until 1966. BC legislation was also extended to people from Japan and India. But this was often blocked by, in the case of Japan, the fact that Japan was a British ally, and Japan would protest to the government in England, which would tell Ottawa, which would block the legislation in BC. In the case of India, it was interesting, it was the British government in India that protested racist laws in British Columbia, because in India they were trying to sell the empire on the idea that it's just one big happy family. Right? Just to put this in perspective, in 2014, the BC government did a review of provincial legislation. They found that out of the 1,734 pieces of legislation enacted in BC at that point, 223 had discriminatory provisions against the Chinese. That's over 10% of their legislation. During the 1920s, the extent of racism in BC actually led many Chinese to leave BC for other parts of Canada. And years later, Adrian Clarkson recalled, "My father always was very clear to us about the fact that we should never go and live in Vancouver. All the overseas Chinese knew what Vancouver meant. I didn't go to Vancouver until I was 32 years old, and I still don't particularly care for it." Presumably, she said this, by the way, long before she was governor general. What is important here is that the real problem is not the fact that there is a Chinese population in Canada. The problem is white racism. No one is born a racist. People have to be taught to be racist. And over the previous 50 years, that's exactly what had happened. The idea that the Chinese and Japanese were aliens who didn't belong, whose cultural practices were different, even barbaric, that were genetically different and able to carry disease and work harder and live on less, was repeated time and time again in white supremacist discourse. This discourse was entirely made up of white people, we trace it back, and I have, it's white people repeating what other white people said about what other white people said about the Chinese. At no time does it actually include Chinese people saying, actually, this is what it is. And if you look at the record, whenever there are Chinese voices that appear, they actually say, hey, oh, folks, it ain't like that. You know? And this is ignored. Over time, what was originally a minority discourse, as we saw in the case of Alexander Mackenzie, had become mainstream. If a lie is repeated often enough, it becomes accepted as a truth. I think this is something that's important to remember for today. The lie was able to be maintained as well because most white Canadians did not have any meaningful contact with Chinese Canadians or other Asians. The contacts they had tended to be in sort of ritual circumstances, like picking up their laundry from a Chinese hand laundry or ordering in a Chinese restaurant. Macquarie also said that it's, in the end, that it's desirable that we should have a white Canada and should we not become a yellow or mongrel nation, thus echoing John A. Macdonald's words from 40 years earlier. And his views were shared by the Prime Minister at the time, William Lyon Mackenzie, King. King claimed to be an expert on the Chinese good. He had been the Royal Commissioner who'd settled the damages following the 1907 riots. But he claimed that the issue of Oriental aliens was mainly an economic one because of the fact that people couldn't compete against them. But he also agreed, as he says here, it's impossible to ever hope to assimilate a white race with the Oriental races. And furthermore, if they were allowed to come in, we would lose the homogeneity which ought to characterize the people of this country if we were to have a great nation. So the idea that you want to be great, everybody's got to be white, was very much ordinary ideas. The idea that Canada should be exclusively a country controlled by and for people for the benefit of people of European origins is central to what I call the colonizing project that created this country. We can see this when we look at the comments of this man, George Black, the Member of Parliament for Yukon. Black was born in Ontario, and he goes to the Yukon in 1898 as part of the Klondike Gold Rush. And he opened a law office in Whitehorse in 1900, and he subsequently was named the commissioner of the Yukon, in other words, the governor of the territory. And then he went into federal politics and was elected to Parliament, where he eventually became Speaker of the House of Commons. So have no doubt, he is a respectable person for expressing respectable views. And what he said is the Chinese and Japanese immigrants were, quote, an invading army. That the invaders are consolidating their position in British Columbia, they're made their way into Alberta and Saskatchewan, and the advance guard is right here now in Ottawa, making its presence felt. And he warned that soon Canadians would be battling these invaders for their very existence. It's important to note, his claims are not just they're not just rhetoric, they're not just like rhetorical exaggeration, okay? At the time, 1921, Chinese immigration was 2,700 people to Canada. That's hardly, it's hardly an invasion, right? His comments actually mask the fact that it's him. He's the one who's the invader. At the time that he entered the Yukon territory, it was the only nominally Canadian territory. It was actually under the control of the Indigenous nations of the Yukon. Canada only signs treaties with the Indigenous nations of the Yukon in 1921, right? By positioning himself the Chinese or Japanese as invaders, he's positioning himself as native, as somebody who properly belongs here in an uncontested and unproblematic way. And in so doing, by the way, just eliminates the idea that the people who were truly native to this land for millennia, tens of thousands of years, were the ones who were also being displaced by himself and other invaders like him. This idea that Canadians are invaders is central to understanding what is behind Chinese and Japanese exclusion. And this is exactly the idea that if Europeans are non-invaders, if they can say those people are invaders, that somehow they belong. But centrally, the project of colonization that created Canada was about converting the territories of Indigenous people into the private property of people from Europe, and especially from Britain and their descendants, all right? And part of that project is to keep other people who might come and also have property out. And what's important on the west coast of Canada, the Chinese and Europeans arrive at pretty well the same time. Chinese first arrived during the 1858 gold rush. At the time, the European population is a couple of hundred people, almost all working for the Hudson's Bay Company. And we can see this, for example, when one BC invader, early invader, told a member of the 1885 Royal Commission on Chinese Immigration, said, "We want you to prevent the influx of Mongolians because we want to be here ourselves and don't want others to be here. You will not consider it strange if I tell you that as good Englishmen, we see no reasons why any men except good Englishmen should live in the country." The process that I'm talking about here is technically called settler colonialism. And it literally has paved over the landscapes of our everyday life and the markings of our contemporary society. So as we look around Toronto today, what do we see? Okay, well, we see various signs in Chinese and in other languages, it's true. But when you look at the street signs, when you look at the names of other things, you would never know that this was a place that was occupied by indigenous peoples for 12,000 years. It's been occupied by people of European origins and the rest of us for just a little over 200. Other than a few names in indigenous languages, such as the name of Toronto, and a few signs in Chinese and other ethnic ones, the reminders of the past that dominate, the monuments, the names of the streets, the political institutions, the designs of our cities, even the languages that I'm speaking today, the language I'm speaking to you today, comes from another part of the world, many thousands of miles away from here. All of these are of European and especially British origins. And as a result, we tend to take this for granted. But this sort of landscape paves away, quite literally paves away the memory of other people who are here and who made this place. So when we think of Canada today, we think of this. If I put this up, one of the things I used to do with my students is I am really challenged graphically. I would draw a map freehand of Canada on the board, and students would laugh at me because it was so bad, but they always recognized what I was drawing. There's so much we take this for granted. But not so long ago, Turtle Island, as it's called, was this. This is the first map of Canada, made in 1763. And it's basically Montreal, St. Lawrence Valley from Montreal to the Gulf of St. Lawrence. In 1867, a confederation, this is Canada. The Chinese have already been in what was to become Canada for 9 years at this point. Right? And how this expands to that first map of Canada is actually an important story. And it's a story that is rarely told properly, because it's a story of conquest, of genocide, of the use of military force, as well as a lot of political institutions and processes that are built into it. So just to give you one example, when MacDonald was introducing his anti-Chinese legislation, it was at the height of the Northwest Rebellion, also known as the Second Riel Rebellion, or Northwest Resistance it's also called. And this included military actions on the plains, not just against Riel's Métis, but most of the actions were actually against indigenous people on the plains who hadn't taken treaty as yet. When the Chinese entered the west coast of BC at the same time as Europeans, they threatened a European monopoly on property. And as a result, one of the things I wanted to mention, because somehow my slides are in order, is the idea that Chinese are foreigners are so built into this world. I just wanted to mention the example of Daniel Quan Watson. Quan Watson, like me, he's Canadian-born, and he's half Chinese, half white. He's also the Deputy Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada. He has noted that he's experienced racism 10,000 times in his life. He's been called chink thousands of times. He was assaulted by adults when he was a child. He was told to speak white when speaking French. He was refused entry to Canada for not having a visa while carrying a Canadian diplomatic passport that did not require a visa anywhere. And even when he was a minister, he was once walking along outside in front of Parliament Hill, and a police car raced up and stopped him in front of his office, and the police officer asked him, "What the F do you think I was doing?" And he's never taken for granted that he's the person in charge, and he's often mistaken for being a bellboy. Right? So this idea that Chinese are foreign goes back to this, is really built into the constructing of such settler colonialism. And you know, it has this idea that somehow if you're Chinese, if you're Asian, you can't be Canadian. In 2012, the Bank of Canada was doing the new $100 bill. Initially, they had an Asian woman, not Lucy Liu, on the back of the bill. But focus group said she couldn't represent Canada because she was Asian. But a white woman apparently can. Right? It's important to note that the Chinese have a long history of being in this country. Right? That we have been continuously connected. What makes Canada today has been continuously connected to people and things Chinese. European explorers, when they came to what is now Canada, were not looking for Toronto. I'm sorry, I have to say I'm from Ottawa. They weren't looking for Ottawa. They were looking for China and for navigable passages to the Far East. During the French regime, one of their major exports was ginseng, which they were selling in China. And today, Canada has a west coast because of this, which I'll explain in a minute. In the late 18th century, a triangular trade developed between the west coast between England, the west coast of what's now Canada, and China. It was a trade that involved sea otter pelts from the west coast. At the same time, the British were entering the territory of the Spanish War too, and they almost went to war over the issue. But what decided it was this. In 1788, Captain John Mears, a British captain, bought 50 Chinese carpenters and shipwrights from Hong Kong, from Canton, to build a fur trading fortress and trading ship called the Northwest America on Nootka Sound. And this is what established the British claim to the territory. So if we have a west coast today, it's because of those Chinese workers. Interestingly, when Mears was chased out by the Spanish, he abandoned his Chinese workers. Many of them, we think, made back to China through the Spanish route. But others, as late as the 1830s, were rumored to have stayed living in the woods, which made them the first permanent settlers on the west coast of non-Indigenous people on the west coast of Canada. Chinese communities in Canada date back continuously to the 1858 Fraser River Gold Rush in what became British Columbia. As I mentioned, when it arrived, the non-Indigenous population was a few hundred people. And during the mid-1870s and 1880s, the Chinese were likely the majority of the non-Indigenous population in BC. And they were certainly the majority population in certain areas like the Cariboo. If they too were invaders, it seems they were polite ones. In 1859, the Nlakatna people of the lower Fraser Canyon blocked the gold miners from coming up in what they call a war, until there was, as they say, there was a treaty negotiated, something that the British officials deny. But they allowed Chinese miners through because they asked permission to enter their territory. In 1900, we know that a lot of Chinese men in this era had close relations with Indigenous communities. And in 1900, 1 out of every 6 conjugal relations of Chinese men in British Columbia were with Indigenous women. We also know the story of the building of the CPR as being sort of one of the more important turning points in the country when Chinese workers not only completed it, but the idea of what was going to finance the CPR was the China trade. The whole point was to create a British route from England to China, to Hong Kong, and from there to other British possessions in Asia. And it was the China trade that was supposed to pay for it. That's why Chinese merchants were not subject to the head tax, and why, in order to create exclusion, MacDonald had to do it in terms of the political exclusion. It should be noted that MacDonald's legislation to give people the vote was based on private property ownership. If you own private property, you could vote. The problem was the Chinese also owned private property. This connection to people and things Chinese continues in many different ways. We see it in terms of families and family links and their realities. We also see it in things like this. You know, assembled in a single factory in Shenzhen that assembles much of the world's computers and almost all Apple products. So too, we remain material connected today. And And these connections are not only important for the individuals involved, but as they're central to Chinese-Canadian resilience in the face of exclusion. And since their first arrival in the gold rush of 1858, Chinese Canadians have fought for their rights. As early as 1862, we know Chinese secret societies were organizing to provide people with mutual aid. In the 1870s, the merchants from Guangdong province had organized home county and clan associations to provide assistance. These early migrants, it's important, didn't see themselves as Chinese. This is a modern 20th century concept. At the time, they were subjects of the Qing Empire, and they identified themselves based on their home county. They spoke different languages. They didn't have a common language. Right? They spoke 4 different dialects of Cantonese as well as Hakka. Right? But despite this, they had to band together to fight their oppression. And we see this most importantly, in 1884, with the formation of the Zhonghua Huilan, or Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association in Victoria. This association was established by charter from the Imperial Qing government, and then also under BC statutes. It has been correctly described as a Chinese local government. Right? It arbitrated disputes in the community, intervened to support those in trouble with the authorities, and provided public services such as repatriating the bones of people who had died here, and in the 20th century, even providing such things as a Chinese public school, which continues to function until this day. Chinese benevolent associations become key institutions in virtually every major city in Canada during the 20th century. Racist oppression was forcing people who didn't see themselves as the same group to band together for common cause, and this led them to develop the idea that we're Chinese. And Chinese nationalism actually develops in Canada a little bit earlier than it does in China, believe it or not. That's generally true amongst overseas Chinese communities. And they're starting to develop a sense of being Chinese. And we can see this in what I call the most important political event ever to have taken place in Canada, which was in 1899, when the Baohuanghui, or Chinese Empire Reform Association, was formed in Victoria, BC. The Baohuanghui was established by Kang Youwei, who led the 100 Days Reform. And in 1898, as we know, the Empress Dowager Si Taiho staged a stout palace coup, arrested the Guangxu Emperor, and ordered the execution of the leading reformers. Kang was away at the time. He fled first to Japan and then to Victoria, BC, where a year later he establishes the Baohuanghui, and its translation in English is this Protect the Emperor Association. This is the first mass Chinese political party. By 1903, it has a worldwide membership of 500,000 people. It pioneers the methods later used by Sun Yat-sen and the Tongmenghui in terms of mobilizing support. Right? It is, and it even is the first group to establish politically involved women, so it has women involved in its association. Now, why is this so important? As the first mass Chinese political party, it's the direct precursor to things like the Kuomintang and the Chinese Communist Party that today has 92 million members and world-shaping experience. We can also see this nationalism in 1911 when Sun Yat-sen comes to Canada and raises, he's on a tour and he goes to major centers. He speaks to crowds of thousands of people. He raises $35,000 Canadian, which is almost $1 million today. So it meant that when the Xinhai Revolution starts in Wuchang and Sun arrives, he arrives with Canadian money in his pocket. Somebody think about this, right? We also see it in 1923 when the Chinese community mobilized to protest the Exclusion Act. The act was passed in the province too quickly for them to really do anything. But Chinese leaders, including Joe Hope, who was sent by the CCBA in Victoria to Ottawa to lobby, as well as Casey Mark from Toronto and other community leaders, came to lobby the Senate. All right? What's important to note is that the Senate does an unusual thing with the bill. It establishes a special committee to study it. The committee calls witnesses and it reports back. None of the witnesses it called were Chinese, even though the Chinese leaders were sitting in the gallery as they were passing the law. So the Exclusion Act is passed, once again, itself an act of white supremacy, by excluding Chinese people from any discussions of what their future in the country are going to be. Yeah? And we can really see this, I think, what the consequence of all this coming home in the case of this man. This is a picture of Juan Alexander Camillo voting in 1949 in the federal election for the first time. The first time he was able to vote in his entire life in Canada. He was 88 years old at the time. Right? And the reason that we have democratic rights today in Canada is because people like Joe Hope, like Juan Alexander Camillo, struggled for them their entire lives to get there. It's because of Chinese Canadian communities that we are able to actually enjoy these rights today. I think this is something that's very important to remember. The reason that people have rights is not because politicians graciously grant them. It's because people force them to grant the rights that they're entitled to. Okay, so where do we go with all this? Right. Just to sum up a bit here, the Act itself was repealed in 1947, as are the discriminatory voting regulations. The voting regulations are repealed for a couple of reasons. One is that Chinese Canadians volunteered in the Second World War and fought for Canada, and when they came back, they demanded the right to vote, and this time they were supported by other veterans, by non-Chinese veterans. Right? In 1946, Canada passed the Citizenship Act, so suddenly whether you're Canadian or not was a local matter. It wasn't about being a British subject, so that's another one. But the real difference was the United Nations. The UN was establishing itself, it was requiring equal treatment of its members for everybody inside of a country. And in fact, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, when it was established in 1948, the Canadian delegation initially opposed it because they knew it was contrary to Canadian law. And it's only after they found themselves in the company of South American dictatorships in Saudi Arabia that they changed their minds. All right? Okay, where do we go with all this? Okay. Where do we go with all this? I think there's a number of things that are going on here that I really want to underline. First, Chinese Canadians and their complex links to China and other Chinese people around the world are an integral part of Canadian experience. And they will continue to be so for many years to come. And these links will become more and more important as China emerges as one of the world's most important countries. Second, the idea that the Chinese are aliens who don't belong in Canada is as old as the country itself, even though people from China have been in what is Canada since before it existed, and have consistently contributed to the making of this place. Third, the reason that everyone who's a Canadian citizen enjoys democratic rights is that people like Camillo and Hope fought for them. And rights don't just fall from the sky. They're established by people fighting for them, by organizing within their own communities and then building allies to win support. And first, finally, and most important for me, anti-Chinese racism is not just a matter of individual prejudices or people with bad attitudes or who are ignorant or who are badly intentioned. It is a social structure of exclusion that has been built into the making of this country. In this country, it's a social structure of exclusion that is linked to this equally devastating, maybe even more devastating structure of exclusion is shaping the lives of indigenous peoples. Right? And this is important to think about. If we're talking about a social structure, we can't change that simply through educational efforts. People who are racist, who think that they see somebody as Chinese, just telling them actually, hello, they're not Chinese. Or did you know the Chinese were here since, before the country, are unlikely to change their views. During the COVID pandemic, one of the first incidents of racist violence was in March 2020 in Vancouver, when an indigenous woman was assaulted, being told to go back to China and to take the China virus with her. I doubt the person being assaulted would have really changed very much. You say, actually, man, she's not Chinese, she's indigenous, right? This is not going to change it. What changes this is politically organizing. The structure of white supremacy in this country that was built into it was organized by a government. And what can undo it is people organizing as well to do that, to affirm their rights. And doing this involves several things. First, fighting racism begins by bringing into broader knowledge and understanding the experiences and knowledges of the people who racism exclude. This reveals the structure of racism and how it works. Secondly, it continues by building alliances with people across differences with shared projects. We know that people, when they work together for common goals, suddenly the space for racism no longer exists because they see each other as human beings like themselves for everything that implies. It also involves working to build a country in which it is the racists who are the aliens and not people like those Chinese Canadians who had to register under the Chinese Exclusion Act. Thank you. If I could just say one more thing. If you want any further things, this is just out as of Thursday. This is a publication that is free. It's available at the website challenging.racism.ca. It's a collective group looking at the 1923 Exclusion Act and its origins. Also explores the context of the times, what's happening with Indigenous peoples, with African Canadians, with Japanese Canadians, and so forth. So it's a resource we hope will be useful for many years to come.
Anyone have any burning question you want to ask the professor? We have time for a couple of questions, burning questions. Oh, there.
Well, being an Orwell alumni, you did a fantastic job.
Thank you.
I think you and I teach a lot of past history. In fact, in our Chinese Cultural Center Brainstorm, we have a great Hakka wall to recognize the Hakka Chinese not only in Toronto but around the world. And you actually have brought up a lot of history, untold story, and we really like to have more of your voice and your information to share with us. And we'd like also to invite you to come over and to give us a more broader, more in-depth presentation to all of us. Thank you.
I'd be delighted. Thank you.
So we will have a time for more discussion later on. So this time, if you have a burning question, you have one more question we can ask. If not, I'd like to ask other.
Hi, Professor Stanley. I have a question regarding the recent bill on S237 about foreign interference. It's now in the Senate, and I read through the bill itself. I didn't see any special concern from my point of view as a Chinese, but my concern rests with the last list. There's an attachment should list the countries that should be listed as potential or threat to the Canadian authority, sovereignty or politics. And I have concern with that list itself. If it's a universal act, not single out any country, I'm fine with that. But I would like to ask your opinion on my observation. Thank you.
This is a question that I have some very personal concerns about myself. Because depending on how it's required, I mean, an initial version that was bandied in the press was the idea that anybody who has regular contact with an organization under the control of a foreign government. Well, in 1976, the reason I speak some Chinese sort of, is that in 1976, the Canadian government sent me to China, the People's Republic of China, as an exchange student. I arrived in Beijing 10 days before Mao Zedong died, and I left in 1978 just as China was beginning to open up. During that time, I studied at what was then Beijing Yuan, now is Beijing Yunnan Dashi, and at Peking University. And Peking University has a very active alumni association, and particularly is interested in its foreign graduates or foreign people who attended, and unfortunately they have my email address. And like other great universities in the world, they tend to send their graduates notes sort of saying, we have this event, we have that event, which is really about, I know, can you give us some money and we'll name a building after you, right? But it means I am in regular contact with an entity under the control of a foreign government. Does this mean I have to register under the Foreign Influence Act in order to speak to Service Canada about my pension? And I fail to see how this in any way enhances the security of people here. Right? I don't think we should be naive. The government of China, like every other government, has interests and has ways of pursuing them. And at times, diplomats are always cultivating, the Chinese term is guanxi, relations. That's their business. And at times, maybe some of them step over a certain line and need to be expelled. That's true of Canadian diplomats as much as it is of Chinese ones. I've often wondered if the CIA was having a foreign influence operations in Canada, would we know about it? Right? And the things that people are legitimately concerned about, things like having relatives threatened in China by Chinese officials, Foreign Influence Registry isn't going to do anything about that. So what we have is a political storm aimed at attacking the current government on what's in a weak point that has been spun disproportionately. The Johnson report shows there is no foreign influence scandal. It's quite clear, it's unequivocal in that. Of course, he's suspect. He's just a former governor general, university president, lawyer, distinguished person who is known. I know people who know him, and they all talk about his honesty and integrity. But no, he's a tool of the current government. This is becoming a rant, right? What really concerns me, and it concerns my colleagues in the Canada-China focus group who have published this thing, is that what we are actually seeing is the same discourses of 1923, only they're dressed up in a different way. So nobody can talk about, and not even Pierre Poilievre can talk about race and racism and we need to have a white Canada. But I've seen people talk about, China as an existential threat to Canada. That's what they were saying in 1923, right? And so it goes. So I would agree with you. If you're going to do a foreign influence registry, apply it to everybody. If you're going to have a selective list, right, it means that you're okay with some people interfering in your politics and not others. And I find that a really unacceptable position.
Thank you.
For a very scholarly and educational lecture.